I think it's appropriate that we have the fire of a true Pentecostal sister on a day when we're with our brother Dante Stewart. Dante is a true son of the Pentecostal tradition in the United States of America,
Yeah.
and an honest brother. I first encountered his voice when some of you who are with us this morning may have read last year. He came out in the Washington Post with a piece that really I thought was honest about the way that so many of us can be caught up in the trappings of whiteness that have been tied together with Christian faith in this country. And it really don't matter what the color of your skin is, you can get caught up in that because it's so dominant in the culture. And to hear your voice and the way you articulated that, and I think brought some honesty to it, that's particular to your story, to your generation, but also to this present moment that we're in. I thought as we were turning toward our consideration of, racial justice together in the month of February, it would be beautiful to have a conversation with you. So thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, you know it. You know it.
Let me
I'm
just start.
excited. I'm
Let me
excited.
just start by asking if you would give us some of your story, a little bit of your backstory.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
How'd you get on this walk with Jesus, and how's it
Yeah,
going for you?
yeah. I'll give you a bit. I'll do the quick version. So, like you said, I was raised in South Carolina. Raised in a town, a small rural town just below Columbia, South Carolina, on the way to Charleston, small town, Sandy Run. Raised there, and between there and St. Matthews. And so I was raised in a Pentecostal church, son of Calvin and Deborah Stewart. And as I think about my childhood and even kind of how I got here and those kind of formative moments that made me who I was, I can feel kind of the intimate space that I was groomed in the Black Pentecostal church, and just the rituals and rhythms that we were immersed in, that really, in some sense, became a sanctuary and a safe haven for many of us who were coming out of such a terrible experience in the world, or whatnot, and in some ways, it was a place of protection for us young people, as our parents, tried to protect us from the things that they knew were true of our society and that they knew that we would go through as well. And so I went off to Clemson and played football there, met my wife there. And Clemson, and one of the things that's important about, predominantly white institutions. So Clemson University, Duke University, all these, predominantly white institutions. When you play in sports, most of the times, the Christian organizations that you are in closest proximity with are like those like FCA, Athletes in Action, Campus Crusades, et cetera, who are deeply steeped in, the white evangelical tradition of Christian faith. And one of the
And they
things
were happy to see you.
yeah. Yeah, they were joyful, happy to see you and happy to have you around. For a multitude of reasons. They were happy to have you around for a multitude of reasons. Some were less good than others. And so, I went to Clemson and got involved in the FCA and really got deeply immersed in the white evangelical community and tradition. And then I went off to California. My wife and I, we got stationed out there. And then I got hooked up with Calvary Chapel Church out there, got deeper into white evangelicalism, and then came over. We got stationed in Georgia, where we're living now. And that's when, I kind of got thrown headlong. I became a part of a Southern Baptist church, the kind of reform wing of the Southern Baptist church, that particular tradition. Inside of Southern Baptist congregations and denomination. So started preaching, teaching, leading, and then the shootings happening in 2016, particularly that of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. Then Donald Trump happened in 2016. And in response to Donald Trump and to the shootings, the church decided, finally, in some sense, they wanted to, do diversity work, whatever they meant by that. So they wanted to do diversity work, and then they asked me to lead a small group through a book by a white man on race, John Piper's Bloodlines.
Mm.
And as I was going through Bloodlines, I was, as I was, and it's not a linear story. It's not just one day the shootings happen and then boom, I automatically change. It's just not the case. It's not how it happened. It was a mighty challenging process. It was a process of reading and reflecting and wrestling and in some sense still trying to believe the best about brothers and sisters in that community, and still giving them so much of my family and our money and our thought and so much of my research. And so I was leading that group and was still leading that group and still preaching and teaching and leading. And, just over time, man, I just got emotionally exhausted. I got emotionally exhausted, but then, I began to get really angry at the hostility that I was met with. Now, when you start talking about race and racial justice in white churches and even, reconciliation, there is the kind of white exhaustion happens very quickly. White exhaustion happens very quickly. So you have to deal with, I was dealing with my own struggle of trying to make sense of seeing a dead Black body and the ways in which, I ignored dead Black bodies before Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, and trying to make sense of why I was in the white evangelical space. What was it about that space that really, pulled me and others in? And that those months in 2016 was really trying to make sense of that. And so as I was teaching through that book, man, I was reading through it and I was just like, nah, I ain't feeling this. Like there was just so many things, about that book that I found problematic. And in particular, what I found problematic about the book was the assumptions of the book, in some sense, because, when white people write books, and particularly books on race, there's always a politics of whose voice get to be centered in these books. There's always a politics engaged in this. Who do we believe to be valued in this conversation? Who we believe to be centered? Who do we believe to be legitimate in conversations on race and justice? And the problematic things I found were, the most legitimate voices seem to be Black men in white spaces. And it just, I started to pick up on that. And at that time, as I was going through that book, one of my friends, a white brother actually, Drew Hall, handed me a book and was like, yo, Stu, I think you would really enjoy this book. And so the book was Where Do We Go From Here by Martin Luther King. And so I read Where Do We Go From Here, which was actually, interestingly enough, I was raised, my mom and my dad, they're babies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And, particularly they came of age in the 70s with the Black Power movement. So my mom and my dad, they were deeply steeped in this Black Pentecostal and Black Power tradition with a sort of, Black nationalist self-determination and self-actualization and dignity and power and agency that should be bestowed upon black people, and this profound love of Blackness or whatnot. And so, but the thing is, they protected us from so much. They didn't want us to, deal with so much of the world that they had to resist. And so, when I read Where Do We Go From Here by King, that was the first book by a Black person I ever finished or whatnot on my own accord. I'm sure, I read some things in school, but, it was the first one on my own accord. And then he quoted James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. And I read The Fire Next Time, man, and that was it for me. Like, I think, after reading The Fire Next Time, I think as we, if we do read The Fire Next Time, I think The Fire Next Time really helps us see, just in some sense, as Baldwin would say, many people know better, but many people will fail to act on what they know, because to act is to be committed. And to be committed is to be in danger. And this danger in the minds of white folk, Baldwin would write, is the loss of their power and their place and their privilege. So when I read, Baldwin started to give me language to the anguish and to the anger and to the troubling, as the theorist Judith Butler would say, the troubling that was going on in my soul, and the troubling that my speaking up about race began to the troubling of the waters that began to happen in that church space. And so, I was met by two things. I was met by apathy, and I was met by hostility. And whenever we talk about race and things like that,
Hey, can I ask a quick question before you talk about the apathy and the hostility?
Yeah.
Both of which are very, very real. And I think we need to understand them. I wanted to ask, because you're really narrating a tension that you felt that I think a lot of people in different kinds of churches are dealing with right now.
Yes.
And what's interesting to me about your story is that you were able, through the voices of people like King and Baldwin, to reach back into your own experience, right, of a Pentecostal Black liberative church and find some resources.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm curious, before you talk about how white folks responded, what did you find in that tradition that really helped you and helped you see a way forward, helped you hold on to Jesus and the Holy Spirit fire that I know you got inside of you?
Oh man. Now we could talk for hours about this, because, for me, one of the things that, that I tell people all the time, I say, there's a difference between, white education and Black liberation. There's a big difference between those two things. White education, on the one hand, tries to read and develop language simply to convince white people that we are valued and that we are human. Black liberation seeks to do a really close reading of Black embodied experience and Black literature and Black art and Black culture, and see what can we gain and glean from the things that Black people put out into the world to love ourselves, to protect us, to inspire us, and to give us something toward liberation and healing. And so when I started to read Martin, when I read Where Do We Go From Here, I think one of the things, that reading Black people, but particularly, my journey was, it was King, then Baldwin, then I read Eddie Glaude, then I read Cornel West, then I moved into Bell Hooks, and then I moved into Toni Morrison, and then went back to Du Bois, and then I started going into Black literature with Elizabeth Alexander, and then into Black liberation theology with James Cone, and
you realized you had some resources.
Oh, I had some resources. I mean, I was reading Cone. I was reading Eberhard Marshall Term, and I was reading Willie Jennings, J. Cameron Carter. I was reading J.D. Otis Roberts and Katie Cannon and Emily Towns. I mean, I was reading Black womanist theology and Black feminist theory, Patricia Hill Collins. I mean, I was reading Black people. And, one of the things that was so liberating about it was that I was able to see that the things that I was feeling and saying was not wrong, and I was not crazy. And so that was the thing that was so liberating, is that, our lives, our Black lives, and the things that we offer in this world was not simply resistance. It was not simply convincing white folk, but it was the way that we generated meaning and love and joy in the midst of all of this. And so the poet and theorist, Fred Moten, who wrote this incredible book, In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, where he says, that this Blackness, it's a celebration of and in and through our suffering, which is neither distant nor even wholly just right here in the moment, but it is in some sense our embracing of the struggle and finding a way to rise again and finding a way to, he calls it our showing and our miracle. And so this Black literature, you know, gave me not only an interpretive framework to kind of theorize about the world, it gave me an interpretive framework, it gave me theory, you know, to think about whiteness and Blackness and white supremacy and America and democracy and love and theology and belief and God and liberation and all these terms, you know, that we took for granted, and good news and the gospel. And so it gave me a way to interpret my world, but also, you know, it gave me a way to imagine better for us. And so Toni Morrison would say this in The Sight of Memory, in that joint she gave in that paper she gave for the Tanner lectures entitled The Sight of Memory. She says that this idea of memory, this remembering, this flooding of memory, this connection back to the rivers that brought us over and the rivers to which we cross, you know, this idea of connection is being able to stand rooted in the world and connected into a tradition to do two things: to ponder the actual and to imagine the possible. And so for me, Black literature allowed me to ponder the actual embodied experience and the trouble that was happening in my soul and in the world. And how do I think about why in the world does black people have to be treated as second-class citizens? And so then I got into Black Marxism and Charles Mills and Cedric Robinson, and talking about second-class citizenship and disrespect and exploitation and theorizing about Blackness, and in some sense looking at Black liberation theology and womanist theology to say, you know, as Alice Walker would say, that I saw what I consider a womb and then I turned it into a world. And so this connection to Black literature was the ability to stand in the world as honest as I possibly can. To embrace the ugly, beautiful, terrible parts of my own self and my own experience, to lean back on my Pentecostal upbringing and see and feel the world that they were creating with us within the world. And so, as Black nationalists would say, we were a church within the church. We were a nation within the nation. We were a country within the country. We were a people within the people. And so it's, in some sense, was allowing me to embrace that which I came from and to imagine that which I can go to. And this is my son. This is my baby boy. So,
all right. All right.
I'm doing this work for him. This work for him.
That is over here telling the truth. So I appreciate you going into that, because I think that's important for people to understand before they hear. Now, how did your white brothers and sisters respond when you had this epiphany? Well, came on you with such power.
Well, let's just say, you know, whenever you address, you know, in some sense, whenever you address that which people holds dear to themselves, you know, which Richard Hughes, another great book, is entitled Myths. It's called American, I want to say it's called American Stories That Give Us, I want to say it's by Richard Hughes. And it is I think it's called American Myths, or the Myths We Live By, White Supremacy and the Stories That Give Us Meaning.
Folks got Google, they can figure it out.
Huh?
Folks have Google, they can figure out the title.
Yeah. It's by Richard Hughes. We used it in Dr. Franklin's class last semester for Christianity and Politics. And he talks about these myths and stories that give us meaning. And he's talking about white supremacy, and particularly with white folk, you know, whether either unknowingly or knowingly, white supremacy is the story that gives so many white people meaning. And I think this framework of talking about stories and myths are incredibly helpful as we're talking about race and justice. You know, it's not simply, you know, that people have on white hoods with holes cut in them and hiding their faces, but it's about the deeper stories that give our lives value and meaning. You know, and this idea of white supremacy, this idea of we are the center of existence and we are the standard by which all people must be judged against. We are the starting point. And to use theory language, we are, let me use this kind of big word real quick. We are the epistemological starting point and the teleological end. And so we are the starting point of the way people think about the world, and we are the end goal in some sense of the world that they should achieve, or to use biblical and theological language, we are the beginning of creation, and whiteness becomes the consummation of life. And so it's this idea of breaking down the story that gives them meaning. And so when Black folk start talking about Blackness and Black bodies and the embodied experience of Black people, and in ways that is not necessarily about convincing white people, but that we are as equal as your children. The same way you look and intimately listen to your children, the same way you value your mama and your daddy and your grandma and your business partners, are the same way we have value in this world. We are equal. We are alive. We are free. And so I think, one of the things Toni Morrison will say, it's a profound delusion. And so when you start talking about addressing the profound delusion of whiteness and the story of that gives so many white folk meaning, you really, there are three main ways white people respond. Either white people respond in apathy, and I alluded to that earlier. And I mean, you hear stories of Black suffering and Black pain and immigration, and the ways in which people who are non-white or whatnot are exploited or are treated as second-class citizens, or legally, as the boys will say in the Souls of Black folk, either by force or by fraud, are treated as less than and valued less than. Whenever that happens, when you hear those stories and those stories become proximate to your mind and to your heart, and in your surroundings, some people respond in apathy, because the world, in some sense, when you're not in proximity with the struggle of other people, when you don't have that kind of emotional closeness, it really doesn't necessarily affect your life in any legitimate way. And so it responds in apathy. Okay, yeah, it's tough, but it doesn't really, I don't have nothing to do with that. And so, I may share something on social media, but as far as that, it's probably the furthest I would go. I respond in apathy and indifference. Then some people respond in hostility, because they understand, that whiteness is a thing. White folk understand the whiteness of the thing. You look at medical records, you look at the census, or whatnot. White folk, when that race thing come on, or whatnot, and they got to put them documents on that race, I say, hey, white brothers and sisters, hold up that imaginary document, and everybody that didn't put W on that document, put your hands down. White folk will keep their hands up, because they know what white means. And since you put it on your documents, you know what it means. It's just that addressing whiteness is a totally different thing. It's not that white folks don't understand what whiteness is. It's that white folk don't want to deal with what whiteness does. And that's the thing. Hostility that I was engaged, that I was met with, was because I was addressing, and not just me, but many people were addressing not just what whiteness is, but what whiteness does to all of us. And what it does, as Baldwin would say in that letter to In the Fire Next Time, in some sense, for many reasons, white people are convinced that, Black people are less than or whatnot, and they don't want to lose power and place and privilege. Or whatnot. And so you're met with hostility. But then, the final way, I think, that we engage in these talks, that white people respond, is in some sense, almost this kind of, it's solidarity, but it's like, it's on a continuum. It's like, it's a sort of like trepidation that moves into more kind of engaged forms of solidarity, where it's like, I'm understanding things that are happening. I understand, I'm doing the reading. I'm trying to get re-educated, as Martin Luther King said. I'm trying to get re-educated. I'm trying to reimagine. I'm trying to reprioritize. And so, you respond in, kind of emboldened forms of solidarity, moving from trepidation to more boldness and courage. And so it's not a linear kind of progression. It is what to be human is. It is to learn and to mature and to fail and to grow up and to do it again and again and again and again and again. And so, especially as we're talking about justice work, it's that we engage in this constant struggle. I said the other day, as we started Black History Month, Black History Month is not simply asking the question, how can we remember and talk about Black folk and learn Black folk name? But the question becomes the more ethical and the more theological question. If we're talking about Jesus and empathy and this kind of theological narration of solidarity and Jesus's solidarity with the people who are marginalized, and this kind of moral framework of being a neighbor and neighbor love. We can't just simply, ask the question, how can we learn the names of Black people? But we must ask everybody, not just simply white folk, but all of us must ask, how can we love Black people? By seeing us, hearing us, relishing in us, and creating a world where Black people feel loved, inspired, and protected. And so for me, that's the world that I was working for. And that's the world that I could not create in white evangelicalism and whiteness in general. That's the world that whiteness can't create. We need to imagine, as Frantz Fanon said, at the end of the wretched of the earth, he says we need to imagine a new person. We need to imagine, as Jesus would say, a new humanity, a new way of belonging together, a new way of loving our neighbor, a new way of loving God, a new way of loving our world and embracing one another in hope and in honesty and beauty.
Yes, indeed.
Got that Pentecostal fire, Dante. I was thinking, a question as I'm listening to you is, when I grew up, I grew up Methodist, by the way, and then I ended up in the Pentecostal movement and joining the charismatic church, and we talked a lot about principalities and powers, and but there was a certain way we thought of them, like this demonic force that possessed individuals, and when I look at what happened at the Capitol and I look at what's happening in our country, I don't think there's a better name for it than that we have a spiritual war going on, right? That there are some principalities and powers. I mean, I look at those Jesus signs alongside the Confederate flag that were in the Capitol, and you're like, man, we need to cast out some demons, up in here. And yeah. I mean, for folks that may not identify that as a form of spiritual warfare, I'm kind of wondering how that Pentecostal background, like how the historic Black church, how that history you're drawing on informs kind of how we name some of those spiritual forces that are at work right now.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I will first preface this with, I am not a scholar of the Black church. So I'm only working on the things that I'm reading and the things that I'm wrestling with. And so, I would point people to, particularly to this book that we actually are reading in class. I don't have it with me, but it's called The Black Church and the African American Experience by Sierra Lincoln and Lawrence Mamiya. And then you have that joint by E. Franklin Frazier and I think Lincoln, The Black Church Since Frazier and the Negro Church in America. It's a little baby book or whatnot. And so as I think particularly about my Pentecostalism, we have to realize that this idea of naming, is almost foreign to my Pentecostalism that I grew up with. This idea of naming something a principality or naming it's too kind of abstract or whatnot. What we did, back then was about, it wasn't really about, in some sense, like simply naming, but trying to create a space beyond resistance and beyond terror and beyond this kind of hatred that so many of our parents knew and so many of our people knew. And so like the Pentecostalism that as I'm trying to think about the capital and the ways in which, my Pentecostalism allows me to, in some sense, think about my son and came back in here. The way my Pentecostalism allows me to think about the capital, I think about, the church in Acts chapter 2. With the way I grew up, Acts was more so the kind of miracle of the text, and the power of the text was in the ability to speak and to discern and to interpret. But the more that I've come to understand Pentecostalism, and even the Pentecostalism of my youth, and even now in this moment, I lean back on William Seymour. That during that time in early Pentecostalism, and I'm going somewhere with this. You have Charles Parham, who is for many is deemed the father of modern Pentecostalism. You have Charles Parham in Topeka, Kansas, and that movement during the Topeka, Kansas movement or whatnot. Then you have this poor black brother coming from Louisiana, if I'm not mistaken, named William Seymour, and he comes up through Charles Parham's place and things like that, and he gets trained by Parham, makes his way up, I think, to Cincinnati, Ohio, then over to Los Angeles. And then the Azusa Street revivals happen, or whatnot. The Azusa Street revivals happen. William Seymour goes off he sends a message to Parham like, yo, these people are speaking in tongues, people getting baptized in the Holy Ghost with fire, and people are starting to come together in ways that we have not imagined before, not experienced before. Charles Parham comes to Los Angeles, and instead of rejoicing in the goodness of the Lord and rejoicing in the work that the Lord was doing, Charles Parham said that they were engaging in crude Negroism. Negroisms, that's what he called it. He said they were engaging in things that were anti the spirit. So Charles Parham was imagining people coming together as not being fundamentally the work of the spirit, but fundamentally the work of Satan. And so if I'm thinking about my Pentecostalism and the ways as I read William Seymour and Charles Parham and the things that were happening at the Capitol, I first see that so many white believers in this country have so identified whiteness and Christianity together as being the work of the spirit, rather than seeing the work of liberation as the work of the spirit. That wherever people are working for freedom and working for justice and working for democracy, that is the Pentecostal spirit in America. And so that's what William Seymour would say. He said, it's not speaking in tongues. I don't care how many tongues you speak. If your Pentecostalism, if your faith, if your Christian faith is not about love and creating a world of love, no. If my son.
We lost your sound there, man. I think you might have hit mute on your computer there. Maybe your boy did. Oh yeah, we got you back. Yep.
Okay. So you got me back?
Yeah. Oh yeah, man. We're feeling it over here. People didn't know they was getting up for church this morning.
Okay.
So, yeah,
perfect. I gotta keep this from my son. So instead of Charles Parham identifying this liberating work as the work of the spirit, he saw loss instead of liberation. And so too often, white folk in America who believe America to be a Christian nation and to believe the country to be white and to believe that both should be protected by the good news of the gospel, they see the work of God and liberation as the loss of their place and power and privilege. And so if I'm thinking about Pentecostalism, I'm thinking about how can we tell stories of liberation and not stories of loss? How can we tell stories of liberating faith and not in some sense fear? How can we tell stories of the Capitol as seeing a disordered Christian love, as a failure of Christian love, as a failure of Christian faith, as a failure of Christianity? And the reimagining work that happened in Acts chapter 2 needs to happen in our own society. And so when I think about Pentecostalism and my Pentecostalism and my grandma Pentecostalism, my mama and my daddy Pentecostalism, I ain't thinking about white folk in that. That's white folk. The capital, that's y'all problem. That's white folk problem. That ain't my problem. That ain't Emmanuel Church in Swansea, South Carolina. That the capital ain't our problem. You know, we will pray for you and we will pray with you. But I think the capital is to expose the ways in which white Christian faith, in some sense, has not only evaded, justified, and denied white supremacy, but in some sense became the ways in which this white supremacist project has been protected. And so as we think about the capital right now, we have to realize, like, yo, like we black folk, yo, we've been saying this for centuries. We've been saying white supremacy and white Christian faith is a problem. We've been saying this for centuries. We've been saying that, you know, people have gotten power who have been working in all type of networks to create a country committed to white Christian male rule rather than committed to equality and justice and freedom and love for all people. I mean, we've been saying this for centuries and we have died because of it. Martin Luther King, as we think about Martin Luther King wasn't killed. I mean, it didn't just die. He was murdered. He was murdered. He didn't just die. He didn't just die of natural causes, you know, just got old and tired and weak. No, he was murdered because of the certain type of ways he was trying to imagine a faith in a country beyond the logics and bounds of whiteness. And so as I think about Christianity and Pentecostalism, it is the ability, in some sense, to allow people who are not in the center of our faith to be able to be given voice, to be able to speak the good works of God, to be able to, in some sense, dance and be free and to imagine something better than the country that we are in right now. And so I need Pentecostal fire. I think we need Pentecostal fire, not the type of fire that would allow us, in some sense, you know, to dance and to shout all over the church alone. No, but to be able to go outside of our church and say, you know, there is a thing that needs to happen in our society and in our world that looks that is beyond, in some sense, this idea of, you know, white people being the center of Christian faith simply being about getting the beliefs right, simply being about, you know, performing in the right ways. Nah, Christian faith and Pentecostal faith and this work of the Spirit is the ability, in some sense, to talk about our world in honest ways and work for it in ways, you know, that will actually change the world that we live in. Because you can't in some sense say, you can't in some sense read Acts chapter 2 and simply read it as a story of this kind of fantastic movement of God.
Yeah.
Acts chapter 2 and beyond is a ugly, messy story. It is a, you know, I don't want no Acts church. You know, I mean, that's a lot of work. You got all types of mess in Acts church or whatnot. But this church is the beginnings of a new type of imagining and a new type of belonging. And I think that's the type of work we need. We need, in some sense, you know, I mean, we need to hold those white supremacists at the Capitol accountable. Or whatnot. Imagination does not happen if, in some sense, you know, we don't be honest about what's happening. You know, we as the article just came, we treating it. Man, come on, Asa. My boy is he doing the most. Come on, man.
You got a powerful word, my brother, and
yeah,
you
man.
Have other obligations and responsibilities. We sure appreciate it.
He's trying to shake the foundations.
I know. You're talking about disruption and you experiencing it too. Tell us, I know you've been working on a book along these lines, and I understand it comes out this fall. Give us a little preview of how we can hear some more.
Yeah. So my book, man, it's I can't talk too much about it, but I can say a little bit. You know, it's really chronicling, you know, an honest journey of trying to find love in the midst of loss. How to you know, find love in the midst of terror and a loveless world. You know, I remember Baldwin talking to his nephew, and he says, you know, at the beginning of that of The Fire Next Time, you know, he says, you know, here you were to be loved, you know, baby, hard, and in some sense, in the most beautiful ways possible, to protect you against a loveless world. He says that, you know, none of us would have survived had we not loved. And so in some way, my book, um,
Oh, we lost you. We lost your sound there. So we're going to keep. You're back. Tell people how they can follow you too, and keep track of it as the book comes out.
So yeah, I'm good. So last thing on the book. So it's in some sense it's a collection of essays and meditations, kind of mixture between memoir and manifesto on finding love in the midst of terror and the midst of loss. And embracing Blackness and loving Blackness, and my story of being reconnected back to my tradition, and kind of the world that I imagine beyond this moment. And so the way you can follow me, just go to my website, dantestewart.com. I'll have updates coming up on the book, or you can visit me on social media at Stewart Dante C. Very easy, at Stewart Dante C. And I always try and hit people back. So you hit me up, and I try and hit you back.
So good to be with you this morning and to have this conversation.
Yeah, brother.